Since US President Donald Trump took office, he's had the chance to replace 2 Supreme Court justices, and he's choosing younger, conservative voices, which could affect rulings for decades. And with justices now serving into their 80s, it's worth wondering why they don't have limited terms or a mandatory retirement age. This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. Appointing a Supreme Court justice is a chance for a US president to cement a legacy long after leaving office. Judges can serve for life if they choose, and that's often why the nomination process becomes such a partisan political battle. A spot has opened up on one of the most powerful institutions in American life. There's a vacancy on the Supreme Court, and that means another bitter nomination process in the US Senate. It's high stakes, not only because it will shift the court further to the right, but also because the new judge could serve for 2 to 3 decades. Supreme Court justices have life tenure, but as lifespans get longer, do they represent the views of generations past? Is it time for term limits? Supreme Court justices are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Appointing a judge is a chance for a president to cement a lasting legacy.
I've often heard that other than matters of war and peace, this is the most important decision a president will make.
With Justice Anthony Kennedy retiring, Donald Trump is appointing a second Supreme Court justice before he's even halfway through his first term. The confirmation of the conservative Brett Kavanaugh would also help shape the political leaning of the court for decades. That's why the process often is so politically polarizing, with heated Senate battles, smear campaigns, and advocacy groups paying big sums to try and influence the outcome. The 9 justices get the final word on the most controversial issues in the country. The court has become the ultimate arbiter. Prominent decisions include the 1954 ruling to racially integrate public schools. Roe versus Wade was the 1973 judgment legalizing abortion. But perhaps no other event shows the power of the Supreme Court judges than their decision after the election of the year 2000. The court effectively gave George W. Bush the presidency over Al Gore by ordering an end to Florida's vote recount. Bush was ahead there by the slimmest of margins. The US Constitution ensures life tenure, stating that judges can, quote, hold their offices during good behavior. But every other major democracy has term limits, a mandatory retirement age, or both. 2015 polling found that most Americans support term limits. 66% agreed with a 10-year cap. The Supreme Court of the United States is supposed to act impartially, but with almost every vacancy comes partisan and political point scoring. Are unlimited terms dysfunctional for the judicial system and the court? And is life tenure behind the times? And I'm very pleased to say that joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C., we have Russell Wheeler, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, who was formerly the deputy director at the Federal Judicial Center. From New York, we have Gabe Roth. He's the director of Fix the Court, a non-partisan organization which wants more accountability from the Supreme Court. And here in the studio, I'm welcoming the broadcaster and author, Carol Gould. Thank you all very much for joining us. Russell, let me come to you first of all. How important an institution, let's establish this first of all, is the Supreme Court in American life?
Well, it's the highest court in the land. It's the last word on matters of federal law. It is subject to review by the Congress on matters of statutory interpretation. its constitutional decisions can only be reversed by a constitutional amendment. So it's not on a par with the president, obviously, but it has the last word in very important cases.
You see, this is what I was trying to establish is, yeah, okay, the president is supreme in his position, but just below him, from everything I've heard, unlike in other countries, comes perhaps the Supreme Court ahead of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Would you agree with that, Russell?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. Congress, when it functions, it's not functioning now, but when it functions, it has broad plenary authority to legislate in all sorts of areas. The court can only decide cases brought to it. So I think that overestimates the authority and power of the Supreme Court to say it outranks Congress in terms of its clout.
Okay, Gabe, does it, in terms of its lasting impact on the American way of life, outrank perhaps Congress? Because Congress's decisions can be changed hither and thither. New congressmen can be voted in, new senators can be voted in, but the Supreme Court judgments pretty much last a lifetime.
Well, that's very possible. They definitely can. They can last decades. And to Russ's point, the Supreme Court only takes cases that are brought to it. So the idea that you would have individuals on the court serving for 20, 30, or 40 years, that's a big decision and has a big impact on the country. And that's why I believe that term limits should be implemented to make the institution less like feudalism and more like democracy.
Karen, let me bring you in. We've only recently got a Supreme Court in the United Kingdom. Previously, things would go to the House of Lords, etc., etc. But having lived in the United States and reported from there for a few years and been an observer for most of my working life, there is no way you can equate the US Supreme Court with the British judicial system. It stands alone in its own way, doesn't it?
Yes, and it's been established for so many, many, many decades, whereas the British Supreme Court is a fairly new institution. And I think that the fact that the majority of Americans now seem to feel that the term should be finite, say 10 to 12 years, is an interesting turning point. It's very interesting how much of a following it has, and that there is a lot of debate. I live in the UK, but I watch a lot of American television, and I follow what American journalists are talking about. But of course, right now we have a situation where we have Brett Kavanaugh, whom the president has nominated, who you would say is conservative to the right. We already have Neil Gorsuch, who was confirmed. So if Ruth Bader Ginsberg, I wish her a long life, but if something were to happen to her, then we have a guaranteed conservative Supreme Court for the next 20 or 30 years. And what's interesting is that I was reading the Evening Standard in December 2000.
That's the London Evening paper, yeah.
It's the London paper. And it was during the time when the hanging chads was happening.
We were talking about
it was absolutely, yes. Everyone was on a knife edge. And Christopher Hitchens, a top British journalist, said, Sandra Day O'Connor is known in Washington to be saying, I will not retire until there is a Republican in the White House. Well, eventually there was. The Supreme Court decision tipped it, despite the arguments by David Boyce, the lawyer who represented the Democrat point of view.
So are you suggesting that there is a
she
political...
She did retire, not immediately, but...
overtly political element.
If Obama had been able to schmooze Ruth Bader Ginsberg all those 8 years, he could have convinced her, she would have been willing to retire. He could have appointed a young liberal. So we would have had another liberal for a very, very long time. But she has said quite recently, I'm going to be there at least for another 5 years. She's 85. So that is the situation now. And although Anthony Kennedy was always the deciding vote, most cases, not all, but he seemed to lean to the liberal point of view, but now he's retired. So that's why Brett Kavanaugh has been nominated. It's a very interesting phenomenon, but we'll see. I don't see any legislation being passed in the near future.
Russell, what is the argument against finite terms?
If we had finite terms, we wouldn't have Ruth Bader Ginsberg with us. It's the reverse of the argument. John Paul Stevens. I must say, though, I don't want to put a damper on things, but I think the chances of Congress, if it could do it by legislation, imposing term limits on the Supreme Court is just fanciful. I can't imagine it's going to happen. Congress makes changes to the federal judicial system only in moments of crisis. And although the Supreme Court may not be to our liking right now, it's not in a state of crisis. So I would not give an awful lot of pay a lot of attention to the statements that the American people favor or don't favor term limits for the Supreme Court. I just think it's basically an academic question.
Yeah, academic question is the suggestion from Russell, Gabe, and yet that's what you're pushing for.
It is, yes. And just real quick to correct the record on one thing, Anthony Kennedy was a very conservative justice. He might have had a, quote, liberal opinion on maybe one abortion case or two abortion cases and two same-sex marriage cases, but all the other cases he heard, he was a very conservative justice. But that aside, and he's being potentially replaced by someone more conservative in Brett Kavanaugh. But that aside, yeah, I agree with Russ in the sense that you're going to have a constitutional crisis or some sort of age crisis, mental decrepitude, a justice having a stroke, a justice taking a bribe. There's a lot of serious allegations that are probably going to have to come out before the do-nothing Congress would actually do something, pass a law to change the tenure of the Supreme Court, or for the states to pass a constitutional amendment to change the tenure.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Carol, if I may. Gabe, what is your argument for having finite terms? And Russell, you said why you thought it was unlikely that it would change, but if you could follow up from Gabe by saying what you think the argument is for not having fixed terms. So in favor of fixed terms first, Gabe.
Sure. The Supreme Court is the most powerful, least accountable part of our government. They serve way longer than the founders intended. Their impacts are felt for decades on end. We have justices right now in 2018 who are serving that were born in the 1930s. That doesn't reflect the polity that they represent, the 320 or 30 million people that they represent. So we want justices that are more reflective of the times, that are appointed by presidents of recent memory, not presidents of bygone eras. And it also, term limits would also prevent against a entrenched political view that a lot of the justices have. And I think that as justices age, they often have, studies have shown, get more political and have a higher chance of mental decline. So you don't want a situation
Russell,
where
we're going to come to you for your version of finite terms. You don't think it's likely, but do you think it would be a good or a bad thing if they were introduced?
I don't think it would make much difference. People are talking about an 18-year term for the court, for the justices of the court. Most of them serve a little longer than that, but not much. But to Gabe's point, that the justices are rooted in the ethos of earlier eras, I think the two most progressive justices on the court are the 80-year-olds, Stephen Breyer and Ruth Ginsberg. So I'm not entirely sure that long tenure equates with being out of touch. There are other considerations that apply to term limits. I mean, people have said, for example, that if a justice knew that he or she was going to be leaving the court in a year, might be willing to accept cases that really aren't ready for review just so the justice could get his or her view on that subject entered onto the record. But, you know, that's be true of term limits for any kind of justice. So, you know, I really think the things balance out very equally. I just can't get too excited about it.
Okay. Carol, what is it, 30 plus years since I was watching the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings in the United States, and we're talking about other justices that go back beyond that. Okay, Russell suggests that they are contemporaneous, that they do keep up with events, that they're not sort of, you know, old fuddy-duddies. But what difference would it make if they were younger?
Well, it's a very complicated process, because if you look at Obergefell v. Hodges, which was June 2015, I know Gabe felt that Anthony Kennedy is conservative, but if it hadn't been for Anthony Kennedy, same-sex marriage, that particular case would not have been approved by the Supreme Court. But the fact that Obama was stopped by Mitch McConnell and the Republican Senate from getting Merrick Garland on the court, I kept imagining Franklin Roosevelt, who would have found some way, as he was so good at, schmoozing the Republicans to somehow approve an appointment who was liberal.
Now, Russell doesn't think that anything is likely to be overturned. What's your view on that?
I tend to agree. I mean, I have been thinking about this a lot over the past 2 days, that whether it's 12 years, 18 years, if a conservative president appoints a conservative appointee, and say, for example, Trump, or even if something happened to Trump and we have Mike Pence in the White House, he's got a majority Republican Senate and Congress. Who knows, it might not flip in November. There's going to be an election in November, and your viewers will want to know that it's possible the Senate might turn Democrat, not likely the Congress. But he needs to have, this president...
He wants to get this confirmation hearing through before then.
Exactly, that's right. But, and if he can, if he will. If something happens to Trump and Pence is president, he will try to push it through. But what your viewers need to know is that whether it's, as we've been saying, if it's 12 years, 18 years, 10 years, if a conservative president appoints a conservative, that's who you're going to get.
Do presidents appoint justices, hopefully in their own image, and then find it backfires on them?
Well, it can. There have been cases in the past 30 or 40 years, but it's,
just give us an
more
example.
than, I mean,
got
for
one on the top
example,
of your head?
Kennedy, Anthony Kennedy. Who would have thought that he would vote in favor of same-sex marriage? To me, that's one of the most significant in the past 20 or 30 years. And the Chief Justice, John Roberts, isn't as right-wing reactionary as we thought he would be. But I'm sure that Gabe could give some examples.
Society shifted to the right, but the court perhaps has stayed where it was. So somebody who thought was from the right 30 years ago is not necessarily right-wing these days. Russell, what do you think?
David Souter didn't turn out the way George H.W. Bush had hoped. President Eisenhower said to regretted deeply his appointments of Earl Warren and William Brennan. I think generally, though, the justices more or less play to form, and presidents pretty much get what they asked for. Over a period of time, of course, views evolve and the justices evolve with them. If I can just say, though, going to this point of the president appointing conservatives, one of the real flaws in our American system, it seems to me, is the following. There's a view that presidents, that you put a popular stamp on the judiciary because presidents who are popularly elected appoint justices who reflect generally the ideology of those who elected them. In this case, we have a president who did not have a majority vote by any matter of means, but got into the White House through the Electoral College. So you have a really perversion of democracy going on now. A very unpopular president who's appointing justices with whom the majority of the American people probably would take issue on their views on.
And this is part of the point, isn't it? Is that if he gets the confirmation through before November, and in November, let's say the Republicans lose the Senate, then that court is set up for as long as those people on the court want to stay there. Let's say President Trump is re-elected. We don't know what's going to happen. So 10 years from now, he won't be able to run for office. So 11 years from now, we could have a court that for the next 30 years reflects the views of a president who is no longer there. And that's a dangerous thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about in terms of ending life tenure at the Supreme Court. You want justices that reflect the times. You want individuals who stay a set amount of time and can rotate off the court so the Supreme Court, the institution, doesn't become this overbearing, all-powerful institution that stays the same way for decades on end. To Russell's earlier point, Congress is Article 1, front and center in the Constitution. They've abdicated, obviously, a lot of the power. And when that power vacuum exists, you have a Supreme Court that becomes more powerful. And term limits would simply reduce that power.
So can it deliver equal justice for all, which is what it says in the Portico? Can it deliver that on those terms?
I think it can. I mean, I think it should. There have been a number of cases recently where I think a majority of Americans would say that they haven't delivered equal justice. I think that one of the issues where you have more and more ideological justices, which has happened in recent terms, is you only need 4 justices to agree to hear a case. So some of the cases that the court has been agreeing to hear, whether it be on abortion or the travel ban or other issues, they probably would not have even reached the court decades ago when the court and our country was less polarized. So having people rotate on and off the court more would potentially shake that up a little bit, and you wouldn't have these cases that are, on really just issues outside the mainstream that are coming before the justices.
So Russell, go back to you. The point I was trying to get across is that a president may be 20 years out of office, he may be dead and buried, he may be in prison, we have no idea where that president is, but he's still wielding power. And that's dangerous.
Well, he's still wielding power. Whether it's dangerous or not is a different question. There's no doubt that the Supreme Court is an undemocratic institution. The federal judiciary is an undemocratic institution. It was set up that way. It's the weakest branch, but on the other hand, it's the branch that can protect minorities that the popular branches are likely to ignore. So the idea of term limits strikes me as really peripheral to the more basic question of whether you want a Supreme Court that protects minorities or doesn't protect minorities.
Okay, so the independence of the executive, legislative, and judiciary. I mean, that's important, isn't it?
Yes, and I agree with Russell.
Does that exist when you have a politically appointed
Well, I agree with Russell that it's possibly the least strong of the various levels of government, but it affects Americans' lives for many generations. And getting back to your point about whether justices should be young, I'll play devil's advocate here. That when Mark Zuckerberg was being interrogated earlier this year by Congress, the world watched and thought, oh my goodness, some of these senators, these congressmen are dinosaurs. Some of them might not even open their computer, know how to go to Facebook. And people were saying, oh my goodness, they're so old. However, no one is ever going to say that Ruth Bader Ginsberg or Clarence Thomas, who's much younger than Ruth,
he's in his 70s.
They have got their marbles. Believe me, they know what they're doing. From what one gleans from the Washington World. On the other hand, there is this view that perhaps they ought to be given a finite term.
But let's move on from the finite term.
Gun control. Let's just mention gun control. Your viewers will know. Every viewer in the world, in every country, knows that the United States has a big problem with guns. It's in the news practically every month. So this is a court that, even before Gorsuch was elected, is not going to create anything extreme to control guns. Gun control is a big issue, and I don't see it ever changing now with Gorsuch.
Let's go to Gabe quickly, since he's the one that wants to fix it all.
Yeah.
You're not going to get your finite terms. I think we pretty much agreed that in our lifetime that's unlikely to happen. So what other changes do you think could be introduced that might be acceptable and would make a difference?
I think there are three changes that would make a huge difference at the Supreme Court. The first is for the justices to establish a formal and binding code of ethics. Right now, they're not required to follow the same level of ethics that other federal judges are required to follow. The second thing would be, I think it would be smart for them to allow live streaming audio of their arguments. Right now, the audio of their arguments is released at the end of the week, and I think live streaming the audio, if not the video, would allow more Americans to participate in their democracy by seeing what goes on in the Supreme Court. And third, I think the justices should be required to put all of their financial investments into blind trusts for the time that they're on the court. We don't want the justices trading stocks of companies.
But I mean, let's say they're appointed in their 40s, as Clarence Thomas was, and he decides to stay on until his 80s. That means he's got no control over his money for the rest of his life, pretty much. That's not going to happen.
That's fine. He can have mutual funds. He can have a TPS, which is a government IRA type fund. His wife makes money at various conservative organizations. So, I mean, that's fine. You don't want these individuals to be corrupted through investments.
Tweaks like that, Russell, likely make any difference?
I don't think it'd make a great deal of difference. I certainly agree with Gabe that the idea that the Supreme Court has to be brought kicking into the 21st century and allow people to at least listen to it during oral argument, preferably watch it, is strange in this day and age. But the justices are all opposed to it, the young ones, the old ones, those who during their confirmation hearing say we think TV would be a great idea, change their mind once they get on the court. Around the edges, those might help. I don't think the code of conduct is quite the powerful argument that Gabe does. We've talked about that. I think it would be a good idea to limit the justices' investments, in part because oftentimes you get justices who don't participate in cases and don't say why. Everybody's trying to figure out the reason. It's rooted in their financial holdings. Those minor things would help. Again, I don't think they're going to happen.
So no big changes. Listen, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. We're not here for life, although sometimes if you're watching it or being part of the program, you may think it seems like that. The idea of being on television, the audio recordings or perhaps the video recordings of what the justices say is an interesting one. Of course, in the United Kingdom, until probably only a decade and a half ago, they did not want the cameras in the Houses of Parliament. Now they've got them. They may not like the fact that people can see them, but I think in terms of transparency, it does work. From me, David Foster, from my guests, from Russell, from Gabe, and from Carol, thank you for watching. You've been watching Roundtable. Hope to have your company next time. Bye-bye.